welcome back to this super sweaty, super fun, I'm going to say fun, drum electric video. I'm here in a very sweaty studio. Right now it's coming up to July. July of 2020, June 2020, just, beginning of July. And it's really hot. Now, you're probably watching this somewhere where, it's so much hotter here. That is the case, but here we're just not built for heat. There's no air conditioning. I've got a terrible, terrible fan that's turned off because of audio right now, and it's in a studio that's covered in insulation because soundproofing, so it's just, yeah. I mean, at least the insulation works. Shut up, Harry. So welcome back to the Drum Electric. If you're new here, as always, please hit that subscribe button. And if you're a returning subscriber, then it's always fantastic to see your beautiful face. Today is a lovely different subject. We're moving away from the whole live streaming thing. It's all about good fun things and incorporating electronics within drums. We're talking about the use of external triggers with the SPD-SX. Now, there are many other things you can use external triggers with. Most sample pads have them. So the Yamaha DTX has external triggers. The Alesis sample pad, you can use external triggers. For me, I've just got the SPD-SX at the moment, so that's what I'm going to use. If you don't know what external triggers are, then you are in for a real treat. And if you do know what external triggers are, then you're still in for a treat because they are really fun. So if you don't know what external triggers are, they're essentially little mounts that you can put anywhere around your kit. They're in the shapes of different drums, little bars, things like that, pretty much anything you can imagine, and you can place them anywhere. It's like taking one of the sample pads from the SPD and going, I want to put it here, rather than being limited to just the 9 pads on that sample pad. So I love the SPD, but the reason why I love using triggers with it as well is because this guy is real bulky. So sometimes I don't want it sat next to my hi-hats. The other reason as well is because there might not be room for it, or I just want a different configuration from the 9 triggers that are already on here. So by using triggers, that means that I can have my SPD nicely tucked away next to my 2 floor toms. This means I can trigger pretty much anything I need to through various triggers that I place around my kit, rather than solely focusing on just using the SPD next to my hi-hats. So as you can see right now, I have a trigger on a silent stroke Remo pad on this spare snare drum I had laying around, and then up here I've got the BT1 as my hi-hat. Down next to my bass drum, I've got a KT10, which I'll all talk about in a little bit. So at the moment, I only have 3 triggers set up out of the possible 4 that are outputted from the SPD. This is basically to duplicate an electronic kit with my normal acoustic kit. So I can play the acoustic like a normal groove, and then swap over and play a groove but as an electric kit with various triggers, stuff like that. I'll show you an example in a little bit. So the actual triggers that I'm using, I'll start at the top and head down. So I'll start with the Roland BT1. Now I use this as more of like a hi-hat, a little separate hit, percussive elements, stuff like that. That's my top end trigger. It's a really, really handy trigger, and it's actually really easy to mount pretty much anywhere. It's one of my favourite triggers that Roland do. If you ever get the chance to grab one of these, I highly recommend it, because they're just barrels of fun. Up next, just below it, I have a spare snare drum. I believe this is the Pearl Sensor Tone or something similar. It's a little 13-inch snare, brass, I'm gonna say. But I just had it laying around, so I swapped out the heads for a Remo Silent Stroke mesh head, and then put the Roland RT30HR snare trigger or drum trigger on the top of it. Now that works really, really well with the silent stroke stuff. If you're ever in need of turning an acoustic kit into an electric kit, and you can only change out the mesh heads, then this is a really great place to start. And then from here, down next to my bass drum pedal, I've got the Roland KT10, one of my favourite kick triggers. It's quite bulky, but I've never ever had a problem with it, and is one of the most realistic ones that I could find without then having to buy another actual bass drum pedal and put a little trigger on the bottom of it. Like I said earlier, with all of this is a case of finding what works best for you. These triggers just work best for me. I was debating getting the PD-8 set up here and over here somewhere, so rather than using an old snare drum with a mesh head, I was going to go for the PD-8, but right now this works really, really well for me, so I won't change it until 2 weeks until I get bored and change it completely. So what's the difference between the RT30H and the RT30HR, Harry? That is a very good question. So you may notice when shopping around for triggers and stuff like that, Roland have two essentially the same triggers for just normal heads, and I'm using one of them. I've got both, and they're both great triggers. Right now I'm using the RT30HR. That means head and rim. The RT30H means head. All that means, and it's really, really simple, is that the HR, head rim, means it sends two outputs. So that means you can hit the head of the snare drum, the drum, whatever you're triggering, you can hit the head of it, and that's one surface it'll trigger. Then you can hit the rim of it as well, and that'll send a separate signal, so you can essentially trigger two things from the same drum. They're really, really cool and they work really well. I am a big fan of them. It just depends on what you're triggering and how many trigger inputs you have available to you. So that means that the RT30H, which means head, means that it only sends one output. So if I hit the head, I can assign that a sound, and then if I hit the rim, it's going to play the same sound. You can't assign it two different things. You can only assign it one. And then finally, moving over to the SPD, while I have it on the right, is just because I use it for controlling stuff like Ableton and Mainstage. At the moment, that's pretty much where all of my outputs and triggers are going. It's all going through Ableton or Mainstage or something like that. I don't use the onboard samples very much. For no particular reason, I just prefer having the control through a laptop and stuff like that. So right now, I'm using it for like playing, stopping, the next marker, previous marker, etc, etc. And then I only have about 4 pads free for actually using spare if I need to send a trigger this way, if I'm coming out of a fill and need to go sugar-da-da-da-bonk, stuff like that. So setting these up through the SPD is actually really, really easy. So you may have noticed that on the back of the SPD, there's only 2 trigger inputs, but yet there's 4 trigger options. Basically, think of it in the way that triggers are both stereo and mono. So you have 4 mono inputs, but on the back of this are 2 stereo. Alright, so an example of this is the KT10 and the BT1. They are mono inputs, so they can just take up 2 slots. Whereas the RT30HR is a stereo output, so that's going to take up the last remaining 2 slots. So right now with my triggers, it's kind of counterproductive, and I don't really know why I've set it up like this, but I just have. I've got the KT10 going into one side of it, so that's taking up 2 slots for no apparent reason. And then I've got the RT30HR and the BT1 going into the second input, taking up those last 2 input slots. Now that does leave me with room for one more trigger input. Like I said earlier, I might experiment with a PD-8 somewhere around here, but for now, I just don't need it. The way to plug these in is really simple. So if you've got a stereo trigger, a trigger that's sending 2 outputs, you just plug in essentially a jack from the trigger to the input of the SPD. Now, if you're using 2 triggers for 1 input, like I am with the BT1 and the RT30, basically I've just got a random single jack to stereo pair. Each jack of the 1/4" stereo is going to one of the triggers, and then that's both going into the back of the SPD as a splitter. You don't need anything particularly fancy for this, it just needs a signal with a jack cable. So if you can find a jack splitter, perfect. That is all good. That's all you need. So we have our triggers all plugged in, set up. We understand why there's 2 inputs and 4 available trigger options. Now we need to change those SPD settings so we can actually access those triggers, assign them the samples that we want to, and make sure everything's in the right place. So this is real easy. What we're going to do is we're going to hit that menu button, then we're going to go down to setup. From here, you got a lovely menu where you can change the pad sensitivities, the LCD settings, and blah, 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 blah. We don't need any of that. What we need is essentially the middle option. It should say trig in. It's the 3rd one down. Hit enter on that bad boy, and then you get this lovely screen. So at the top, you'll see trig in 1/2, and then if you scroll across, you'll see trig in 3/4. To swap from these, you use the 2 arrows on the little keypad, all right? You don't use plus and minus to change these. These are the 2 right and left arrows to switch between them. Now underneath this, you've got input type head, rim, or trig times 2. Okay, now to swap with these, this is where you use those plus and minus buttons. So in the trigger inputs 1/2, I've just got the KT10 down on my bass drum foot. So I'm just going to use head and rim because it's only one trigger input. Hit that down arrow and you've got trig 1/2 type. This is literally a big list of all of the available triggers that I believe Roland do and some extras. So you just use the plus and minus buttons to scroll across and find what the name of it is. So in this case, I'm using the KT10, so I'm going to find the KT10 one. So I'm now going to set up trig 3 and 4, which is my snare trigger and the BT1. So I'm going to make the input mode trig times 2. Then you have the two trigger inputs, and it's exactly the same. So trig 3 is whichever one's in your third input, so it's the RT30HR. Again, just use the plus and minus buttons until you find that product name, nice and easy. Then hit the down arrow for your trigger 4 input, which in my case is the BT1, and boom, that is it. We can now assign samples to each of these triggers and use them as separate pads accordingly, and it's a great time. Okay, so now all of the triggers are set up and finally we get to the fun bit. As you can see, the hair is out, the headphones are on. I've got my triggers all set up. I believe on the KT10 I just have a bass drum sound. On the snare I just sort of have claps and things like that. And then on the BT1 I believe it's just a cowbell. So here's the KT10, here's the snare, and then here's the cowbell. It's a good time for everybody, alright? So I'll play a little thing just so you can hear it and experience it. And then yeah, if shoot any comments in the comment section down below, it's a good time for everyone. I think we all know what I'm just about to say. We all know what's coming. And that is it. We have some beautiful external triggers now set up within our playing and on our kit. Now, just because I'm using Roland brand triggers, it doesn't mean that you have to, and they are definitely not the be-all and end-all. I just like using Roland because I'm really familiar with them, they're always really reliable, and they make some nice and dandy products. Now, they're not always available for everyone, same with the SPD. You might be using the Yamaha DTX, the Elisa sample pad, like I mentioned earlier. That's totally fine. There are loads of triggers and options out there available for you to use. Experiment, see what's in your price range, see what you want to get, and then see how you can incorporate it into your own playing in your own setup. And I should say that I am by no means sponsored by Roland for any of this, but Roland, if you're listening, come say hey. If you have any questions about any of this, as always, please comment them in the comment section down below. I love chatting to you guys through either Instagram, Facebook, or even in the comment section. It's always great to hear what you guys have to say. Hit that like button and subscribe for all of our shiny new videos, and I will see you in the next one.